November 1944. A field chapel in a requisitioned barn near Pont-à-Mousson, France. Mud cakes the floorboards. Rain beats against the roof. A group of American combat infantrymen stand outside the wooden doors. They are exhausted. They have spent 7 straight days in the freezing trenches under artillery fire. Now, they want to spend their one morning of authorized rest in Sunday worship. But the doors remain closed to them. A young assistant stands at the threshold and tells them that their service was held before dawn, at 6 in the morning, while they were still on guard duty. The 10 o'clock service is full. They must choose between sleep and prayer. General George S. Patton will soon discover this quiet injustice. His response will completely upend the camp hierarchy and leave no doubt about how he expects his soldiers to be treated. This is the story of what happened when an arrogant base chaplain tried to hide his prejudice behind army scheduling, only to face a devastating lesson in accountability. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We take you behind the front lines to tell the true World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Private First Class Samuel Green was 20 years old. He came from the steel mill neighborhoods of Montgomery, Alabama, where his father worked the furnaces, and his mother taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church. Green was a deeply religious young man who carried a small, leather-bound Bible in his breast pocket, right beneath his heavy wool uniform. He had enlisted in the army to prove his worth, leaving behind the quiet pews of his youth for the frozen mud of Western Europe. He was assigned to a combat service platoon in the 3rd Army, a unit tasked with hauling ammunition to the front lines under constant threat of German artillery. For 7 straight days, Green had lived in a freezing trench, ducking from shrapnel and watching his friends bleed into the cold earth. He had survived the shelling, but his spirit was bruised, and he desperately needed the quiet comfort of a church altar to process the horrors he had witnessed. He walked to the requisitioned barn on Sunday morning, with his boots caked in mud, seeking nothing more than 10 minutes of silent prayer. Chaplain Captain Henry Dowell was 39 years old and came from Billings, Montana. He was the senior base chaplain for the sector, a position that allowed him to stay well behind the dangerous front lines, while managing the spiritual affairs of the division. Dowell enjoyed the privileges of his rank, sleeping in a dry canvas tent with an iron stove, eating hot meals from a clean kitchen, and wearing a tailored woolen uniform with perfectly polished leather boots. He viewed the social order of the American South not as a flaw, but as a natural law that the military had a duty to maintain, even thousands of miles away from home. Dowell frequently told his clerks that oil and water did not mix, and that keeping different groups apart was the only way to prevent friction in a crowded military camp. To enforce this belief, he created a rigid 2-tier schedule for the base chapel, deliberately slotting the service for black soldiers before dawn, knowing full well that their guard duties made attendance impossible. He then used his own empty ledger sheets to claim that these men possessed no interest in spiritual matters. By November 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had slowed to a grueling war of attrition. The American Third Army was locked in a brutal struggle to breach the fortified German lines along the Moselle River. Supplies were dangerously thin, temperatures were dropping toward freezing, and the relentless autumn rain turned the French countryside into a vast sea of suffocating mud. In this high-pressure environment, divisional commanders focused entirely on ammunition counts, fuel reserves, and casualty replacement rates. Social friction and systemic inequalities within the military ranks were routinely ignored by senior officers who considered morale a secondary concern compared to securing the next crossroads. The United States military operated under strict, government-sanctioned segregation, a policy that created 2 entirely separate worlds within the same uniform. White officers held almost all leadership positions, while black units were generally restricted to grueling logistics and support roles. Base commanders and senior staff officers routinely looked the other way when local commanders implemented exclusionary rules, viewing these discriminatory practices as standard operational procedure. This widespread administrative neglect allowed prejudice to masquerade as official policy, leaving frontline troops with absolutely no recourse when their fundamental rights were violated by superiors. The institutional bias was so deeply embedded in the daily routine of the camp that it took a glaring act of administrative sabotage to finally force a confrontation. A single written complaint was about to challenge this entire system of quiet exclusion, setting off a chain of events that would bring the harsh reality of the base chapel directly to the attention of the Army commander. First Lieutenant Donald Vance, a 24-year-old replacement officer from Columbus, Ohio, walked into the chapel office with a heavy stack of duty rosters. He found Chaplain Captain Henry Dowell sitting comfortably by his iron stove, drinking hot coffee from a porcelain mug. Vance placed the papers on the wooden desk and cleared his throat. "Captain, I have a request from the service platoon men," Vance said. "They want to know if the 10 o'clock service can be opened up for general seating this morning." Dowell did not look up from his ledger. "The schedule is fixed, Lieutenant. The colored troops have their designated service at 0600. Vance shifted his weight, his damp boots squeaking on the floorboards. "Sir, they just got back from 7 days hauling ammunition at the river. They were on perimeter guard until 0800. None of them could physically make the dawn service." "That is an administrative matter for their company commander," Dowell said, turning a page. "My chapel runs on an orderly schedule, and I intend to keep it that way." Vance stepped closer to the desk, his voice dropping. "Captain, there are only 3 benches filled in the back of the barn right now. There is plenty of room for those men to sit. They just want to hear the sermon. Lieutenant, you are young and you do not understand how an army maintains internal harmony," Dowell said, finally looking up with a cold smile. "If we begin mixing the congregations during the primary hours, we invite social friction that this command does not need." Vance tightened his jaw. "The regulations state that field chapels are open to all personnel during general worship hours, sir." Dowell leaned back in his chair, tapping his fountain pen against his thumb. "The regulations also give me the authority to manage my flock as I see fit. The 0600 slot is their service. If they choose to sleep instead of attending, that tells me all I need to know about their spiritual hunger. I have already noted the 0 attendance in my weekly report to headquarters." Vance looked at the empty spaces on the ledger sheet, realizing the numbers had been rigged from the start. "So you are using the schedule to prove they do not want to worship?" "I am recording the facts as they happen, Lieutenant," Dowell answered. "Now, if you will excuse me, the white battalions are arriving, and I must prepare the sanctuary." Vance realized further argument with the captain was entirely useless. He took his duty rosters, walked out into the pouring rain, and immediately drafted a formal memorandum to divisional headquarters. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep splashed through the thick mud and pulled up directly outside the barn doors. 4 polished silver stars glinted on his helmet. 2 ivory-handled revolvers rested quietly on his hips. The driver slammed the brakes, and the general stepped down into the slough without a word, walking past the huddled soldiers straight into the chapel office. The entire room went dead silent as his polished boots hit the floorboards. Dowell immediately stood up and offered a stiff salute. "General Patton, this is an unexpected honor." Patton did not return the salute. He studied the captain for a cold, heavy moment. "Who schedules the divine services in this sector, Captain?" "I do, sir," Dowell answered, straightening his tailored jacket. "I manage the religious rotation for all battalions assigned to the base. How many combat men attended your dawn service today?" "None, General. The ledger shows 0 attendance from the service units this morning." "And why were those men absent from the house of God?" Dowell shrugged slightly. "The records show they frequently exhibit a total lack of interest in spiritual matters, sir. They simply prefer to sleep." Patton stepped closer, his voice low and razor-sharp. "A chaplain who schedules worship so that men cannot come is not serving God. He is avoiding men. You knew those soldiers were clearing supply routes and holding perimeter guard until 8 in the morning. You deliberately lock the doors of Scripture behind an impossible timetable to justify your own prejudice. General, I must maintain order among the troops, Dowell stammered, his face turning pale. Order in my army means every man who faces German steel has the right to face his creator, Patton said. You have used the ledger of the church to run an administrative fraud. You have separated soldiers by the clock because you lack the courage to look them in the eye. I will not have my troops split by a coward in a collar. Two choices, Captain. You can either pack your kit and face a court-martial for administrative sabotage, or you can personally stand at that altar and read the liturgy to every single man you turned away this morning. Decide right now. Dowell swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. I will read the service, sir. The verdict was carried out immediately before the morning sun could even burn through the heavy French fog. Military police brassed the doors of the barn chapel open, locking them back against the cedar beams so the biting wind could howl straight through the sanctuary. Patton stood silently at the very back of the room, his gloved hands resting flat on his belt, his eyes fixed on the pulpit. The white battalions were ordered to remain in their wooden benches, while the entire mud-splattered combat service platoon was marched down the center aisle to take the front rows. Captain Dowell stood at the altar, his hands trembling so violently that the pages of his hymnal rustled like dry leaves in the draft. He could smell the thick stench of frozen mud, damp wool, and truck exhaust rolling off the frontline soldiers, who sat directly in front of him. Every officer in the sector watched from the sidewalls as the arrogant chaplain was forced to look into the exhausted, hollow eyes of the men he had spent months erasing from his ledgers. Dowell began to read the liturgy, his voice cracking thin and weak under the heavy weight of Patton's gaze, delivering the full service to a unified house of God. Private First Class Samuel Green returned home to Montgomery, Alabama, after the surrender of Germany. He married his childhood sweetheart in the very same First Baptist Church where his mother had taught him his first prayers, and he spent the next 42 years working as a master machinist in the local steel mills. He became a deacon at his parish, carrying the same leather-bound pocket Bible to every Sunday service until his peaceful passing in 1989. He rarely spoke to his children about the freezing mud of France, but he kept a single piece of clean chapel cedar on his workshop desk for the rest of his life. Chaplain Captain Henry Dowell was quietly reassigned to a remote administrative depot in Iceland less than 48 hours after the unified service. He left the military in 1946 and returned to Billings, Montana, where he attempted to resume his career as a civilian minister, though his former standing in the community had been permanently damaged by the official reprimand in his military file. He lived a reclusive life, refusing to attend veteran reunions or discuss his wartime service, and died in bitterness in 1973. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public press conferences, but he kept First Lieutenant Vance's original memorandum inside the top drawer of his personal field desk until the final days of the war. In a private diary entry dated late November, he noted that an army which refuses to pray together cannot expect to fight together. He wrote that a commander who allows his men to be cheated at the altar has already surrendered his authority on the battlefield. Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention at the field chapel was driven more by a strict, near-fanatical demand for military efficiency and total unit cohesion than a modern understanding of racial equality. They suggest that he simply could not abide an administrative disruption that kept able-bodied combat troops from receiving the morale-boosting benefits of a Sunday sermon. Others have argued the opposite, pointing out that his deep, lifelong religious convictions made him genuinely furious whenever any officer attempted to corrupt the house of God for personal or political prejudice. What is certain is that the single unified service at Pont-à-Mousson established a permanent precedent across the entire sector, ensuring that frontline soldiers were never again denied their spiritual comfort by administrative sabotage. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have overridden the chaplain's authority to enforce equity at the altar? Or would you have left the military hierarchy untouched to preserve administrative boundaries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about the moments that forced people to face what they had done, make sure to subscribe right now.